Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about data and intelligence and looking at why we shouldn't always assume that smart and data go hand in hand.
People are often too quick to make the link between data and intelligence. We seem to have developed that specious notion that the more data you have, the smarter you are.
But it takes more than just data to make us smart. There's more to it. So, what's the story?
When I woke up this morning, it was 5 degrees outside. That's data. Obviously, not all thermometers give the same temperature. It's all a matter of measurement.
Still, an outside temperature of 5 degrees is a piece of raw data. I think we can agree on that.
If it's 5 degrees outside, then I say it's cold, at which point, the data is no longer raw nor factual. I've put it in context. I've interpreted it. The data has become information, which is where we see the inherent subjectivity in contextualization. 5 degrees might not be cold for some people.
If you tell me it's cold, then I tell myself I might get sick. I'm interpreting the data based on experience. I've linked it to something I know. We're in the realms of knowledge. There are two types of knowledge: explicit knowledge, which we can clearly explain, and tacit knowledge, which is harder to explain and harder to convey.
I know there's a chance I'll catch a cold, so I put on a sweater. That's intelligence. An intelligent or smart reaction to the situation. I've taken a smart decision based on my interpretation of the data available.
Our example is obviously a bit simplistic, but it shows the complexity behind these concepts. We can all see the bias and errors that can slip between the data and the decision. The idea that, the more data we have, the smarter we are, is not just a massive leap, it's an illusion.
Especially when you think that sometimes the more data we have, the less we make decisions. We find ourselves trying to control absolutely everything before we even take the risk of making a decision.
Plus, the opposite can also hold true. We sometimes come to a decision too quickly, without really weighing up all the facts.
Let's get back to the idea of bias and the source of errors. It's an area that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Just think about all those media surveys that bombard us with endless figures. Nobody seems to question the number and quality of respondents.
Nobody seems to wonder whether the sample group was representative, whether the questions asked were biased. The only thing separating seemingly sensible statistics from disinformation is the level of intellectual honesty.
Let's take a few examples. Bias initially comes from the measurement. It's 5 degrees, but that depends on the accuracy of the thermometer. It shows 5 degrees, but it might actually be 4.9 or 5.1. That isn't really important in our example, but in some cases it can cause real problems.
Then there's perception bias, when our eyes, or sensors, deceive us, like an optical illusion, which is why it's important to increase the number and sensitivity of our data collection points, which also happens to be a good argument for diversity in business, but that's a story for another day.
There are plenty of other sources of bias. Just change the context of the data and you get totally different information. The list of cognitive bias is long. The need to simplify, the need to act quickly, the awareness that things change through different stages of crisis, the laziness that leads us to look for the status quo, the consequences of too much information. The list goes on.
Not to mention the deceptive simplicity of statistics. Simpson's paradox is an excellent example. You can produce completely different results just by changing the distribution of the group being analyzed. And, of course, there's the risk of jumping to hasty conclusions.
If it rains every time I leave the house, that doesn't mean I caused the rain, which touches on the importance of understanding statistics, but that's another story for another day.
To recap, data reflects raw facts. Once contextualized, that data delivers information that we interpret to obtain knowledge. Knowledge we can use to make smart, informed decisions. But the road from data to intelligence is long and winding, and there are plenty of potholes along the way. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short. Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.